Okay, thank you everybody for coming to the What Every Nonprofit Board Member Should Know um, workshop session, webinar, whatever you want to call it. Today we will be talking about nonprofit board membership. So before we get into it, I'm going to introduce myself and then Nancy will introduce herself. My name is Diane O'Day. I'm a fiscal sponsorship program manager with Southeast Uplift. Southeast Uplift serves District 3 here in Portland. We serve both neighborhood associations and community-based organizations. So in my role, I work with a lot of smaller nonprofits. My experiences in working with a plethora of nonprofits at all kinds of sizes. And I've also been on a few boards. I am on a few boards that all run very differently, which got me very interested and excited in looking at board membership. And because of that, I am a PhD student who is studying nonprofit board membership and what motivates people to be involved in boards. Nancy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Nancy Champlin, and I'm the executive director here at Southeast Uplift. I use she and her pronouns. I have about 35 years of experience working in the nonprofit community. So I've worked on program direction, directing operations, communications, and development. And with Southeast Uplift's board, it's about a 25-person board. I participate in that executive committee, in the finance committee, in the board development committee, our inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility committee, and our ad hoc bylaws committee. I also, in my spare time, my staff will laugh. I serve on the board for the Selwood Community House, and I'm also on the steering committee for Friends of Moreland Woods.
Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, so basically we have some experience and knowledge in nonprofits and in board membership. And in particular, we try to make what board membership means accessible, because I didn't know what a lot of big words meant when it comes to nonprofit board membership. So I like to try to help explain because I sometimes I don't fully understand it. So thanks for coming today, everybody. So we have an agenda. So first we're going to talk about board member duties. So what does that mean? What does it mean to be a board member? What are the required duties? Then we'll get into a discussion of two primary types of boards. There are many other boards, but these are the two primary types, especially when we're talking about volunteer run organizations. Then we'll talk about what makes high performing boards. So like what are some characteristics of a board that's doing really well? Then we'll do a brief discussion on recruiting and retaining boards. So let's get into it. So first we're going to talk about board member duties. So in essence, board members are the fiduciaries. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but this word fiduciary is going to come up a few different times in this presentation. And all it really means is entrusted person. So it means someone that is trusted with something. So it's a big word, lots of syllables, but that's what it means. It means entrusted persons. And they are entrusted to steer the organizations towards a sustainable future by adopting sound, ethical, and legal governance and financial management policies, as well as making sure the nonprofit has adequate resources to advance its mission. So when it comes to board membership, so every nonprofit that is incorporated, whether you're incorporated as an Oregon level nonprofit, so state level nonprofit, or a federal nonprofit, you are required to have a board when you incorporate. And there are 3 officers within your board that you are required to have. So at the least, you need a president, a treasurer, and a secretary on your board. You can add additional officers. For instance, like a vice president is kind of common, or a past president, or maybe like an outreach coordinator, or you can play around with it, but legally you are required to have a president, a treasurer, and a secretary as a nonprofit. So when it comes to board member duties, there are some more like philosophical duties that a board member has, and then there are some like legal fiduciary duties. So some just general duties is that they have to follow organizational policies, procedures, and bylaws. So as a board member, you still have to act in accordance with what the organization wants. You also have to be a champion of the organization's mission, visions, values, and programming. So if you are considering board membership, whatever you're thinking about joining, really consider if the mission, vision, and values in particular align with what you want to promote and what you want to champion. Because once you become a board member, you essentially you adopt a lot of duties and you become one of the faces of your organization. So the primary legal duties that board members have, there are three what are called fiduciary duties, and we're going to unpack what those three duties are. So the three fiduciary duties are what's called a duty of care, a duty of obedience, which really means obedience to the law, and a duty of loyalty. And so we're going to unpack what these three duties mean. So in essence, a duty of care means that you have active and thoughtful oversight of the organization. So a duty of care, it means care, care about the organization, care enough to ensure that the organization is doing well, doing okay. So below here, you'll see a list. Now, these are just some general activities involved with showing a duty of care. So some general activities, especially if you're a board member of an organization that has any kind of money, um, one thing you're going to have to do is monitor the organization's budget. Meaning keep oversight on whether or not the organization is financially healthy, make sure that you have eyes on where money's going, where money's coming from. You also will have to keep an eye out for assessing risks to the organization. So for instance, are you noticing that an organization is spending more than they're bringing in? That might be risky behavior. So keeping an eye out for different risks to the organization. You also may be asked to participate in strategic planning for the organization. I think someone who introduced themselves earlier mentioned that they are curious about how to do strategic planning. Boards usually are pretty involved with that because they are essentially going to be in charge of ensuring that that strategic planning is carried out. It's also important to leverage whatever opportunities you have as a board member. So if you have connections that you think would help the organization, if you see opportunities to help the organization, part of exercising your duty of care is to make sure that you're getting those opportunities to serve the organization. Other activities include showing up, care about the organization, show up to the meetings. If you are a board member, show up to meetings, stay informed. So stay informed about the organization's successes, the organization's challenges, and opportunities that the organization has, and staying engaged. So by staying engaged, you're showing that you care. So staying engaged, that means showing up to meetings, helping out, lending your expertise, depending on what type of board you are, you might be doing a lot of the operational work to keep the organization going. So staying engaged looks different depending on the board, but in general, you want to be an active board member. You don't want to just be a board member in name only. So then we have a duty of obedience. And so that is generally, just think of it as obedience to law, follow the law. So as a board member, you have to ensure that the organization is following all laws, regulations, policies, and the organizational mission. Most important pieces of those are the laws and regulations. So some examples of what that looks like is to ensure that a proper process is being followed. So for instance, say that um, you're developing a budget. You would want to make sure that you're following the process of what is it? What is the process for making a budget? What's the process for voting in a budget? What is the process for passing any kind of policies, adjusting bylaws, things like that? Um, I don't know if anyone can hear that, but there's sirens outside my apartment right now, which is like kind of funny because I'm like, pay attention to the law, obey the law. And then there's like sirens. So like maybe they're after me. I don't know. But anyway, so you want to make sure that that's typo, but ensure legal requirements are met. So as a nonprofit, in order to maintain status as a nonprofit, there are certain legal requirements an organization has to do. Um, Three primary requirements are they have to register their nonprofit every year. They have to file an annual report. This is if you're an Oregon based, I'm just going to keep it focused Oregon based, but if you're an Oregon based, and I think it's federal as well, but you have to register, you have to renew your registration, you have to submit an annual report, and you have to submit your tax forms. So as a board member, you're responsible for ensuring that those legal requirements are met. There's a whole host of other legal requirements when it comes to organization functioning, but those are some big ones when you're running a nonprofit. And also you want to make sure that spending is happening in accordance with the best interest of the organizational mission. So you're going to want to keep an eye on the budget. And Nancy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add for those of you who are here from a neighborhood association, you probably know that there's a set of standards that the city of Portland has that are sort of somewhere between the state regulations that apply to nonprofits, but ones that specifically apply to district coalitions like Southeast Uplift, as well as neighborhood associations. And that set of regulations is called the Office of Neighborhood Involvement Standards for district coalitions, neighborhood associations, and business districts. So all of that has to do around things like making sure there's transparency and accountability and that folks are following the rules. There's a process for grievances, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an important thing that all neighborhood associations need to know what those rules are so that you stay within those compounds.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So neighborhood associations, they have to follow nonprofit law, and then they also have to follow city policy. And then also organizations in general, especially boards, have something called a set of bylaws that you also have to follow. So there's several layers of policies and laws and regulations that you have to ensure are you are complying with. And Nancy and I are happy to help demystify some of those if you ever need it. We do have some trainings on things like how to create bylaws and stuff like that. But generally it just means make sure that everyone's in compliance. So I'm going to switch it over to Nancy to describe what it means to have a duty of loyalty.
Right. So the duty of loyalty is about conducting yourself in the best interest of the organization at all times. When I came on board at Southeast Uplift, because we're a coalition and we are, as a coalition, we are an organization made up of a lot of organizations that serve on the board, we would often get the question, well, when I'm voting on the board at Southeast Uplift, what hat am I wearing? Am I wearing my neighborhood association hat or my other organization's hat? Or am I wearing my Southeast Uplift hat? And the answer to that is if serving on the board of an organization, you're always wearing that board hat no matter where you are. So you always want to keep the best interest of the organization at heart at all times. So, for example, you want to make sure that if you have any conflicts between what you want to make conflicts of interest known. We'll get into a little bit about that in a minute. You want to make sure that you're, not disparaging the organization. You want to be out there, like board members are supposed to be the ambassadors, the champions of the organization. If there's information that is confidential, that is important to keep that information private. And you want to make sure that you're serving the organization for the organization's purpose, not for your own personal gain, and making sure that when you're making decisions, you're keeping the organization's mission first and foremost. And so this happens when you're communicating, it happens when you're making decisions, and basically making sure that you're prioritizing the organization. Now, if you are serving on more than one board, there could be an instance where you have a conflict in that, let's say, an organization. Do you want to go to the next slide and then bounce back to this?
This one.
Yes. So a conflict of loyalty could occur is if you're acting as a board member for one organization, but you also serve on the board member. And let's say the organization, you're in a board meeting and they may make a decision to do something that you feel like, well, I need to be wearing both hats at all the time for both organizations. I'm not so sure if I vote this way, that other organization would benefit because I still have a duty of loyalty to them. It's very simple. There's a solution for that. The state has a process in there. It's called a conflict of loyalty. It's very similar to a conflict of interest. You just say, I have a conflict of loyalty, and you can explain what that is. This policy may work for this organization, but it doesn't work for this other organization that I serve on the board. So I'm not going to be part of this conversation. So you would refrain from having any discussion and being part or influencing the vote on that topic, and you would just abstain for it completely. And that's a 4-step process for avoiding a conflict of loyalty.
And we're happy to unpack this more later if you all would like. So conflicts of
Yeah.
interest.
Yeah, so conflict of interest. So a conflict of interest is when a decision or an action of the organization could have a financial impact on a director or their related parties, which is like your family, a business interest, a partner, someone that's close to you. And that really has to be handled very delicately, so that you make sure that you're complying with your duty of loyalty. So let's say you're on the board of an organization and that organization is going to hire a consultant to help them with strategic planning, and your partner happens to be one of the people in the running for that. You would say, I have a conflict of interest. My partner is one of the consultants that we're considering hiring tonight. And so you declared it, you disclosed it, and then you say, I'm going to refrain from the discussion. And then you can either step out of the room if it's sensitive, or you just not participate in the discussion. You definitely don't take a vote on that. Ideally, you leave the room so that you're not there. People can have a discussion without you in the room. So there's sort of the 5-step practice for conflicts of interest. The important thing here is that there must be a financial benefit to the person, or to someone that is close to them. So an example of where there isn't a conflict of interest, this comes up frequently with the Community Small Grants Program at Southeast Uplift. Sometimes We approve a whole slate of grantees that get small grants. And sometimes the organizations in the room, they may be one of the proposed grantees. They may have applied for a grant, and our grant review committee is recommending that they get one. Because those board members are not personally going to financially benefit from that, it's not a conflict of interest. So they can know that they are compliant with the state law and actually vote in support of that because they will not personally financially benefit from it. So I think it might be good to just pause there and see if there's any questions about anything that we've covered up to now, including conflicts of interest or conflicts of loyalty.
There's a great question in the chat, and this was one that comes up a lot, right? What if you're both a neighborhood association board member? So for those of you who don't know, there's neighborhood associations, and then we at Southeast Uplift, we are a nonprofit that's a district coalition that works with neighborhood coalitions or neighborhood associations. So we have on our Southeast Uplift board, we have people who are both a member of a neighborhood association board, but they're also a member of the Southeast Uplift board. So what about how should people handle that kind of situation, Nancy?
So remember, if you are on the board and you serve on the board of any organization, say you serve on 3 boards, you wear 3 hats at all times. And so anytime you're making a decision on one board or another, you need to keep all of them. You sort of hold all of them at the same time. And if you feel like any decision would not be in the best interest of the other, you just declare a conflict of loyalty and don't vote on it. You abstain from the conversation. You also refrain from voting on it. So that would be a conflict of loyalty. But it's fine if you think this is great for us, this is great for this organization. That's great, and that's fine. And we have not really come across that. Well, there was once. We have an organization that is interested in potentially entering into a contract with us for something, and so the person who's the board member said, "I'm going to declare a conflict of loyalty, let the board make these decisions, and I'm not going to be involved in this," because they felt like their loyalty was divided between their 2 organizations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one question that I've gotten before through my work with the Nonprofit Institute at Portland State University is people will ask, is it a conflict of interest if you hire a board member to do some kind of work for the organization? So for instance, if you have a board member who has a specialization in something, an example that I know very well is a colleague of mine is an equity consultant, and he was hired by the organization. We were on a board together. He was hired by the organization to provide equity consulting. And so some people might raise an eyebrow and say, "Oh, is that a conflict of interest?" And not necessarily, because if your board members have specific expertise and if they're offering their services, if they're not being exorbitant with their pricing, it is okay to do something like that. But what other questions can we field right now related to your board member duties? Because now we're going to transition from duties and talk more about what types of boards are out there.
Can I just add on to what you just said? So the idea with conflict of interest here and these 5 steps is transparency, right? So let's say you're an organization and you own a building and you're going to hire a landscaper, and someone on your board says, "I have a conflict of interest because my partner's firm is the landscaping firm that we're doing." You may refrain from that vote, but the organization can still say, "Thank you, but they can still evaluate it. They can still say, Oh, well, actually, this is the best deal. This is the best skilled for the job, and this is the best choice for us. So just because there is a conflict of interest, if it is disclosed and the person abstains from it, the board can still support it, but you want to make sure that it's documented and you want to make sure that the person declared a conflict of interest. All of this is because you just want to make sure that there's that transparency, and your meeting minutes are going to be that track record that that was done properly.
Thank you. Yeah, transparency is key here. And if you have a question, feel free to say it or type it in the chat. Otherwise, we'll take questions later as well. Okay, we will move forward, but feel free to ask any other follow-up questions. Okay, so now we're going to talk about two types of boards. So there are several types of boards, several types of board structures out there. A lot of folks kind of come into a board with an idea of what their board membership will look like. But the fact of the matter is every board has its own culture, every board has its own way of doing things. And when it comes to primarily volunteer run organizations, there are two primary types of boards. One is called an operational board and one is called a governance board. And so you may be thinking, what's the difference between these two boards? So we're going to unpack that. So in this visual aid, on the left, you'll see the attributes of an operational board, and on the right, you'll see the attributes of our governance board. So we'll start with operational boards. So in essence, operational boards are more common with voluntary organizations. So if the majority of the organization is the majority of the tasks of the organization is being carried out by board members, then chances are pretty high you're an operational board. So both board compositions have these two things in common, that every board member has to ensure the organization is compliant with policy, laws, and regulations. Hopefully at this point you figure that out. But also the board is responsible for outcomes, good or bad. And so one thing that people don't realize is there's a high level of responsibility once you become a board officer in particular. You might be legally liable if you don't have proper insurance, which hopefully you do. But when it comes to the organization, you technically are putting yourself as a responsible party for the organization when you take on board membership. That's not to scare you. It's just you need to come in kind of aware of all the that's expected of you. So in an operational board members, they're generally the managers of the organization. So the board members are the ones who are putting in doing the registration, putting in the annual reporting. They're the ones who are organizing the programming, organizing events. And that's because there's little to no paid staff. In the context of neighborhood associations, there are zero paid staff. We at Southeast Uplift provide capacity building support, but your organizations themselves that are your own incorporated nonprofits do not have paid staff. Board members, like I said, they're responsible for the day-to-day activity. So anything done by that organization is done by the board members. Generally, in this type of organization, in this type of board, there are one or two people who function more as executive amongst the board, meaning they're really they're putting in a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of energy, and they're generally the ones who drive policy and mission. It might be the same folks who hold officer positions, it might not be, but generally it is. Um, and that's in contrast to a governance board. So aside from the two primary responsibilities, duties that everyone has, they are more focused on the ends more than the means. And what that means is they're more focused on seeing the results and monitoring results of the effort than they are about the daily, day-to-day activities of what's happening in the organization. So if you are a board member of an organization that has paid staff, generally you shouldn't you would have to check the bylaws, but generally in a board relationship, in a paid staff organization, nonprofit organization, the board members generally only have roughly one or two people that they have um, oversight on. So for instance, in Southeast Uplift, the board for Southeast Uplift is technically Nancy's boss. And so in the board I'm on a board, and we technically have supervisory responsibility over the executive director of the nonprofit. And then we also have a joint supervisory role over the chief financial officer of the nonprofit. So, but generally, when it comes to like any staff members other than that, the board generally should not be giving directives to those staff members. Any kind of suggestions should be funneled through the executive director. But in general, paid staff are empowered to drive policy in the day-to-day activities. So board members, they don't get involved in developing a process like standard operating procedures of the organization, and they focus more on higher level policies such as bylaws. Their focus is primarily on strategic direction and financial oversight. So they're looking at the books, they're looking at strategy, they're ensuring that a strategic direction or strategic plan is followed, but they're mostly leaving it up to staff. So you wouldn't really see a board member, a governance board member kind of within the organization day to day. There's a hierarchy that's clearly established. So the board really kind of sits over the ED. They have a hierarchy over the executive director, who then manages staff. And in a governance board, decision making is collaborative between the staff and the board. So like staff can make recommendations, and the board can offer suggestions as well. It's a back and forth collaborative process to decide the direction of the organization. But ultimately, for a lot of it, the board has a lot of power, but ultimately the paid staff are generally empowered to carry out the strategic direction. So I'm going to keep it on this visual aid, and I'm curious if you could type it in the chat or just tell us. I'm curious what board either you're part of. So do you think you're part of an operational board or a governance board? Or which one do you prefer? If you're not on a board right now, which of these would you prefer? And also keep in mind, there are some groups where there's kind of a mixture of the two. So while you're thinking about which one you belong to, I'll kind of describe that there can be an evolution from an operational board to a governance board and back to an operational board. So if a nonprofit is very young, chances are, and if their goal is to grow and evolve and become bigger, and more self-sufficient and hire more staff, things like that. In the early stages of a nonprofit, their board may be very much operational, meaning that the board is very much involved, lending their expertise, lending their labor to the organization. And then eventually they may become a governance board, once the organization built itself out and built out its capacity. Now, in the event, like say an organization that has a governance board, say they lose they lose their executive director, they lose other key staff, then some members of that governance board may step in order to fill some gaps and add capacity while a new employee is being recruited and hired. That's why that brings us back to the point of why it's so important to ensure that you are properly recruiting and engaging your board members, which we'll get into later. Now I'm going to check the chat and see what people think. So, KJ, I'm so curious. Can you describe, you said you're on 2 operational boards and 1 governance board. Which ones do you think are operational versus governance? Oh, and your mic might still not be working. So if it's not, feel free to type it and then I'll follow up. But Erica's saying, I believe Roseway Neighborhood Association is an operational board. It's very likely. So neighborhood associations tend to be operational boards because it's fully volunteer ran. So it generally neighborhood associations very much function as an operational board. Okay, so Julie makes a good point. So back to the evolution. So Sellwood Community House is a governance board, but the year we started, we were operational. Yeah. And Jason's saying the same, that you're a governance board now. And you know, that might go backward. You might need to be operational again, but that does show the evolution. Okay, so Sherry's saying the NAs are operational, but a church board that Sherry's on oversees staff and is more governance. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so KJ is involved with the neighborhood association and also with Southeast Uplift. So in the context of the neighborhood association, Foster Powell Neighborhood Association, KJ is an operational board member. But then when it comes to Southeast Uplift, because we do have paid staff, we are more established. We have our own capacity, we have our own funding that our own budgets we work with, all that. So the neighborhood association board membership, I hadn't thought about that. But yeah, the neighborhood association board membership is operational, and then the Southeast Uplift board membership is more governing the organization. Yeah. Is anyone feeling confused about what kind of board they're on that they would like to run by us? Okay, Sherry's asking, in the governance board, is the executive director typically a member of the board? I'll let Nancy also add some thoughts here, but typically an executive director is like part of the board, like part of board meetings and things like that, but they should never really be, and I don't know if I'm speaking in too absolute, so hopefully Nancy will check me if I'm wrong here, but it's my understanding that an executive director should not be a voting member of the board. And I don't even know if they should really be considered a member of the board. I think sometimes they can be, but they definitely shouldn't have, they should have a say in the decision making, but they shouldn't be voting the same way that board members would. Nancy, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so the executive director is going to work closely with the board because the board of directors supervises the executive director. It's good to have that separation. So it's very, very atypical for an executive director to be considered part of the board. But I think the key takeaway there is that it's really critical that the board president and the executive director, I've heard this great analogy is that they should be operating like a twin jet engine, that they're both flying the plane in the same direction, they're going in the same direction, they're on the same page, they are both piloting that organization and working really close with each other. because one person is making sure all the governance pieces are happening, and the executive director is critical to informing that, and working with the board on all that strategic direction, the financial information and reporting. And then the executive director is really working all on the day-to-day stuff and keeping the board and especially the board president informed about everything.
Thank you. Okay, so we just did that. All right. So now we're going to just briefly talk about recruiting and retaining high performing boards. So generally, high performing boards. Within a high performing board members are empowered with the necessary information and context needed to be champions of the organization. So in essence, they need to have the information about the organization. They need to understand the organization's context and culture in order to properly speak about the organization and also properly engage in board meetings and in other organizational board activities. So they need to have what they need to know, they need the necessary information. They need to know what they're doing, in essence, is what that means. They also need to know what's expected of them. So board membership is interesting in that it's a volunteer opportunity, but it's also long-term and sustained. And so it typically, depending on what kind of board, I would say neighborhood associations or operational boards, it can take a lot of time. It can essentially be a part-time job. So when you communicate with board members, they need to know what's expected of them in terms of time. They also need to know what kind of expertise are they expected to lend to the organization. So expertise can be lending your experience. So like, what's your experience or what's your interest? They also need to know what level of effort's necessary. So say you came in to an organization thinking your workload would be more of a governance. So, oh, you show up to a quarterly meeting, you do some meetings every now and again, and then you learn that it's operational and suddenly you're working 20 hours a month on this board. That might be a misalignment. So in order to perform well, board members need to know these things before they engage. And in high performing boards, I love the phrase many hands make light work. There's a shared responsibility. So there's collaboration. So people are working together in tandem, kind of like what Nancy was describing, and they share responsibility. So in the context of like a neighborhood association board, you might have like your land use person, your social media person. You might have someone who's championing like the picnic for the year. So ensuring that's not all one person, essentially. So how do you do that? How do you actually recruit board members? So first things first is you need to understand what skills, expertise, and attributes are most important to your organization. So say you're looking around the room and you're like, we have so many people who are great at putting together an event. That's awesome. But oh my gosh, we don't have anyone who's good at budgeting. So then you might want to think about, okay, we need someone who knows finance. Let's make sure we're recruiting someone who knows finance or fundraising, so thinking about what are skills someone needs to have that would really benefit the organization and then also help them feel fulfilled in what they're doing. Also, board membership should not be where a conversation or a relationship with someone begins. Start small. This is so important. You need to cultivate relationships with folks before they just dive into being a board member. So cultivate relationships with volunteers, with people who are interested. See if there's committees you can get them involved with, some one-time volunteer activities you can get them involved with. Really help them get to know the organization before they commit to full board membership, because it is quite the commitment. And also it's important to appeal to what motivates people. So this is just a model of board member motivations. And so here are some questions people ask before they join an opportunity. So rationally, they'll ask, does this opportunity materially benefit me or my career? And that can be broadly construed, but people will think about like, oh, how will this help me? How will this help my career? So like youth, for instance, youth really love it when you appeal to how something will help them with college, get into college or get a good career. We have a separate workshop that we have, recording that we have on volunteer recruitment that we can definitely share. It's on our YouTube playlist. And it kind of delves deeper into this, but then people will also join for effective reasons, meaning they have an emotional attachment to the cause for the organization. So appealing to that for some folks. And then finally, there's normative motivations. So that would be, that's when people think, do others I'm connected with also engage with organizations? So with neighborhood associations, inviting your neighbor to join the neighborhood association is a pretty effective way of getting people involved because they see that other neighbors, other people in their area are getting involved. And when you do recruit board members, be clear on the time commitment. Be clear on how long their term is. So if it's a 2-year term, make sure that they know it's a 2-year term commitment. You're going to be at a meeting monthly, whatever, and let them know what's going to be expected of them. Because the more informed a person is before they join the board, the more likely they will stay with you. So when it comes to retaining your board, here's just some general suggestions. Make sure that you have developed an onboarding process for your board members. So how are you getting them the information? How are you getting them background of the organization? And if you can, assign them a mentor who's in the organization who has been a board member for a few years. That way, if they have any questions, they can reach out directly to that person. Also, it's important to provide board members with the necessary documents, background information, and clear descriptions of what their role is. So, or, if you have a handbook of your board, if you have bylaws, anything related to your organization, make sure that a incoming board member is able to access those things. And also with retaining your board, make sure that you have meetings that are regularly happening. That way they know that they can expect on the first Thursday of the month, every 2 months, there's a meeting that they have to attend. So making sure you're consistent with your meeting scheduling and making sure that you are consistent with getting your agendas out to people, nitty-gritty things like that. And finally, one big way to retain volunteers in general is give thanks and show appreciation. So when people are donating their time to be a board member, tell them thank you. Give them make sure people know that they're appreciated. Okay. And that concludes our workshop. So I am going to stop sharing and I'm going to open it up to Q&A. It's always kind of like turning lights on after it's been dark. Like you're like, stop sharing. You're like, ah. All right. What kinds of questions can Nancy and I answer?
Are there any common pitfalls that you see boards commonly fall into?
Yeah. I'll be honest. I'll say that a common pitfall that I have noticed is that when people join a board, thinking it's not going to be that heavy of a lift, and then suddenly they're completely administrating a nonprofit. So that's kind of what I would call like a misalignment of expectations and the reality. So they may think, so one thing we didn't talk about something called advisory boards, and those are extremely hands-off kinds of boards who show up and give some advice and then they leave and go about their day. And so some people may get involved thinking they're an advisory board and then suddenly they're managing an entire nonprofit. So that is one primary pitfall I've seen, is if someone isn't clear on what's expected of them, then they'll burn out very quickly. Okay, and then there's another question. Do you have any advice on developing an onboarding process or model I'd point to as a good resource? I'll get back to you on that one. I would say just in general, so general components is if someone's thinking about being a board member, before they even sign up, have them talk to one or two current board members that have any questions answered. And then also, if you can, depending, so Erica, I believe you're part of a neighborhood association. So like in the context of a neighborhood association, I would recommend scheduling an orientation where everyone gets together and gets up to speed on what's expected of them, what to expect. But Nancy, do you have any additional resources or suggestions related to onboarding?
Yeah, well, one of the things that Southeast Uplift does is we provide an orientation. And when you're preparing something like an orientation, you sort of want to think through what are all the governing documents that this person is going to need to know so they can fulfill the duty of care. They're going to need the budget. They're going to need to know if we have a strategic plan. They're going to need to know, if we have particular rules, what our bylaws are, those sort of things. And it's also helpful in those interactions with other board members or during the orientation to get a sense of like what the culture is of the organization and how that plays out in meetings, expectations. I think one pitfall that I would also add is just sort of starting really strong and then sort of fading off and then just stop showing up. If that happens, then um, it's a burden on the organization because oftentimes, in order to pass, to vote on something, you have to have a certain number of, like your bylaws usually say, you have to have at least this many people in the room compared to the number of board members that you have. It's called a quorum. You have to have a quorum to be able to vote on something. And so if you're not going to show up, make sure you know what the organization's process is for alerting someone that you can't. And if you keep finding that you can't, maybe it's time to reconsider if that's the right fit. But the worst thing that you would want to do is just stop showing up, right? So that just makes it hard for the organization to function and know with certainty if you're on the board. And hopefully they would follow back up with you.
And Bing says that Mount Tabor Neighborhood Association held a board retreat that was separate from the regular meetings to meet the board members and plan activities and interests for the next year. So I love that, like essentially having just a meeting just for the board membership relationship. All right. Well, thanks everybody for attending. I'm going to stop recording now. Nancy and I will hang around to answer any other questions, but I do want to be mindful of time. So thank you everybody for attending. I will send a recording of this eventually. And Erica, if anything comes up, feel free to email me. And I'll also reach out to you if I see anything else related to your question about onboarding, but I'm going to type my email in the chat.
And then also, Diane, will you send the slide deck that you made out as a PDF to folks?
Yeah.
Great.
All right. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to stop recording. And if anyone has any other questions, I'll answer them.